Looking back, I thought I had it all figured out, or at least I convinced myself that I did. My wife, Emily, and I had been together for almost 2 decades, married for 20 years to be exact. Our 20th wedding anniversary was approaching quickly, set for March 15th. If someone had asked me a few months ago, I would have said without hesitation that I was content with how our lives had turned out. Sure, like most couples, we had our squabbles here and there, but those were just tiny bumps in an otherwise smooth road. Honestly, if I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. At least that's how I felt at the time. The only real storm we weathered as a couple came early in our marriage, right around our 3rd year together. We'd gotten married young, as was common in our small Midwestern town. Emily was 19, and I was 21, fresh out of college and ready to take on the world. Our families had always been close. In fact, Emily's older brother, Chris, had married my cousin, Laura, a few years earlier. It just made sense that Emily and I would follow in their footsteps. The first big challenge in our marriage was trying to start a family. Chris and Laura had their first child, a baby boy named Jack, just a year after their wedding. Meanwhile, Emily and I were struggling to get pregnant, and it didn't help that her family, particularly her dad, was constantly dropping hints about wanting more grandchildren, preferably boys to carry on the family name. It wasn't malicious, but the weight of that expectation was hard to ignore. After months of trying and no results, we decided to see a doctor. The news wasn't devastating, but it wasn't exactly what we wanted to hear either. The tests showed that Emily was perfectly healthy, but I had some minor fertility issues. Nothing too serious, the doctor reassured us, but enough to make things a little slower than usual. He said it would happen in time, but the waiting wasn't easy, especially with family members casually asking when we'd finally join the club. Thankfully, by the 4th year of our marriage, our prayers were answered. Emily gave birth to a beautiful little girl we named Sophie. She was perfect in every way, with her mother's golden hair and bright blue eyes. The pressure eased, and life felt manageable again. Of course, Emily's dad still made it known that he'd hoped for a boy, but he adored Sophie all the same. Not long after Sophie's arrival, Emily became pregnant again. This time, we had a boy, Ryan, which seemed to make everyone around us ridiculously happy. I wasn't about to admit it to anyone, but I felt a small sense of relief myself, like I'd finally proven something. By the time Ryan was 2, we welcomed another addition to our family, our youngest son, Daniel. Life felt like it was moving at lightning speed. For so long, we'd been waiting, and then suddenly, our house was filled with the chaos of 3 kids under 6. But it was the good kind of chaos, the kind that fills a home with laughter and noise. Emily and I juggled parenting with work and social events, but we made it work. Our extended family was always close-knit, which made the early years easier. Chris and Laura, now with 3 kids of their own, lived just a few streets over. Emily's younger sisters, Jenna and Beth, were also starting families, so our kids had plenty of cousins to grow up with. Weekends were filled with barbecues, birthday parties, and impromptu get-togethers. I used to think how lucky we were to have such a supportive community around us. As the years passed, our kids started to find their own paths. Sophie, now 16, was blossoming into a confident young woman. She was outgoing and driven, always busy with school clubs or hanging out with her tight-knit group of friends. Ryan, at 14, had the athletic streak, excelling on the soccer field and always wearing that mischievous grin that reminded me of myself at his age. Daniel, the youngest at 12, was our little intellectual, quiet but sharp as a tack. He spent hours tinkering with gadgets or losing himself in books, and though he sometimes felt out of place in a family full of extroverts, we always made sure he knew how much he was loved. As our 19th anniversary loomed closer, Emily and I began planning a celebration. Inspired by Jenna's recent milestone party, we decided on a dinner at our favorite local Italian restaurant with close family and friends. At that point, life seemed like it was exactly where it should be. The laughter around the dinner table, the soccer matches, the family trips, everything felt solid, unshakable. At least, that's what I told myself. That day, I was sitting at the dining table, sipping my coffee and flipping through the sports section, when Ryan stomped down the stairs. He was grumbling about something, though I couldn't quite make out the words. Before I knew it, he had plopped his soccer gear onto the table, scattering papers and crumbs everywhere. Ryan, I said with a sigh, trying to keep my voice calm. You know the rules. Clean up after yourself before you head out. He rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. That struck a nerve, and I snapped, telling him to pick it up immediately. What followed was a heated back and forth, the kind that happens in any household with teenagers. But then Ryan said something that stopped me cold. Why do you care so much? You are not even my real dad. The words hung in the air like an echo that refused to fade. His face instantly changed, and I could see he regretted what he had said. He muttered a hurried apology, grabbed his gear, and ran out the door. But for me, the damage was done. Those words hit me harder than any argument we had ever had. What did he mean by that? Was it just a frustrated teenager trying to get under my skin? Or was there something more behind his outburst? The question gnawed at me for the rest of the day. When I mentioned it to Emily later, she waved it off, saying Ryan was just being dramatic. You know how teenagers are, she said, her tone light, as though it was nothing to be concerned about. But her response did not sit right with me. Was she brushing it aside because it really was harmless? Or was she trying to hide something? That night, lying in bed, I could not shake the unease. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. I thought about how Ryan was so different from Sophie and Daniel, not just in temperament but in little ways, like his smile or the shape of his eyes. Were these differences just coincidences, or were they signs I had missed all these years? By Monday morning, the uncertainty had become unbearable. On a whim, I found myself researching DNA testing labs online. It felt absurd and invasive, but I reasoned that it would put my mind at ease. I told myself I was only doing it to silence the doubts, nothing more. After some deliberation, I chose a lab that promised quick and accurate results. Collecting the samples turned out to be trickier than I had anticipated. I managed to get mine and Daniel's easily enough, and Sophie's was not too hard either. I told her it was for a family ancestry project, and she thought it was cool. Ryan was a tougher nut to crack. He was still on edge from our argument, but I found a way to sneak his sample without raising any alarms. Once everything was sent off, all I could do was wait. The days that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Ryan seemed to have moved past our fight, and life went on as usual. Emily was her same warm, loving self, and nothing in her behavior suggested anything was amiss. Yet, every time I looked at her, I could not help but wonder if she was keeping something from me. When the results arrived a week later, my hands shook as I opened the envelope. I had arranged for it to be delivered to my office. There was no way I wanted Emily stumbling upon it before I had a chance to see it. As I read the report, relief swept over me. Ryan was my biological son, no question about it. The words strong match and 99.99% leapt off the page, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But just as I was about to file the report away and move on, a note at the bottom caught my attention. It recommended contacting the lab to discuss the results further. At first, I thought it was just a marketing ploy, but curiosity got the better of me. When I called, I was connected to the lab director, Dr. Hopkins. Mr. Johnson, thank you for reaching out. Have you had a chance to review the results? He asked politely. Yes, I replied. It looks like everything checks out. Ryan is my son, correct? That is correct, he confirmed, but there was a pause before he continued. However, I need to bring something else to your attention. It is about the other two samples. A chill ran down my spine. What about them? I asked, my voice barely steady. Dr. Hopkins hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. The results suggest that Sophie and Daniel are not your biological children. Based on the DNA comparison, they appear to share a mother with Ryan, but not the same father. His words felt like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I could not breathe. The room seemed to tilt, and the phone slipped from my hand. This was not real. It could not be real. But as I stared at the report in front of me, the truth became impossible to ignore. My world, the life I thought I knew, was crumbling before my eyes. The next thing I remembered was waking up slumped in my office chair, disoriented and surrounded by the concerned faces of my coworkers. Give him some air, one of them said, while another gently asked, David, are you all right? I nodded weakly, mumbling something about being fine, even though my chest felt like it had been crushed. They insisted on driving me home, and I didn't argue. When I walked into the house, it was quiet, blissfully so. Emily was at her part-time job, and the kids were still at school. Shaking, I sank into the kitchen chair and called the lab back, my hands trembling as I dialed. Dr. Hopkins answered, his tone carefully measured but heavy with sympathy. Mr. Johnson, I deeply regret how this was handled earlier. Delivering results like this over the phone is never easy, and I'm truly sorry for any distress caused. I forced myself to stay calm and asked him to explain the results again, slowly. Dr. Hopkins confirmed that Ryan was undoubtedly my biological son. But Sophie and Daniel? The likelihood of them being my children was almost non-existent. My voice cracked as I pressed him for clarification. But the results showed we were close matches, didn't they? Could this be a mistake? Dr. Hoskins sighed gently. If it were only one sample, perhaps we'd suggest retesting. But with both Sophie and Daniel showing no genetic relationship to you and matching each other as full siblings, the results are nearly irrefutable. A cold, horrifying thought struck me. Chris, could it be him? The idea of my brother-in-law, someone I had trusted and shared so much of my life with, being involved in this betrayal was too much to bear. I asked the question aloud, barely able to hear my own voice. Dr. Hoskins suggested sending in a sample from Chris for confirmation, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was spinning, unraveling every memory, every interaction, searching for signs I had missed. The weight of it all was unbearable. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed, bandages on my arms, and Emily sitting by my side. "David, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice filled with concern. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away, unable to meet her gaze. How could I even begin to tell her what I now knew? How could I face the fact that everything I had believed about our family was a lie? Over the following days, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. Ryan seemed lighter after our earlier talk, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. But Sophie and Daniel's quiet, knowing looks told a different story. They had known about Emily's affair with Chris for years and had carried that secret in silence. My stomach churned at the thought of Emily placing that kind of burden on our children. Chris, of all people, my wife's brother-in-law, my cousin's husband, someone who had been a part of my life for decades. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, one that I couldn't begin to heal. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. Emily's affair with Chris had gone on long enough to leave deep scars in our family. It took every ounce of strength I had, but I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I sat all three of my children down and told them everything. I didn't sugarcoat the truth or try to soften the blow. They deserved honesty. Sophie cried silently, her tears breaking my heart all over again. Daniel, usually so composed, hid his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Ryan sat stiff and quiet, anger flashing in his eyes. They wanted to confront their mother immediately, but I convinced them to wait. I needed time to figure out what to do next, and I didn't want them acting out of pure emotion. Despite their pain, all three of them swore their love and loyalty to me. They vowed they would never forgive Emily, but I reminded them that she was still their mother. Even as I said the words, the bitterness burned in my throat, but I forced it down for their sake. That night, the four of us, Sophie, Ryan, Daniel, and I, sat together in the living room, lost in our grief. We cried together, but it wasn't enough to ease the pain. Deep down, I knew I couldn't simply move on. The thought of revenge crept into my mind, not as an act of spite, but as a way to reclaim some control in this chaos. But whatever I did, I knew it had to protect my children from further hurt. And so, I sat in the quiet of that night, staring at the shattered pieces of my life, trying to find a way to move forward. After countless sleepless nights, I came to the conclusion that revenge wouldn't fix anything. There was no grand gesture that could repair the damage or ease the betrayal. But I couldn't keep silent either. The truth had to come out, and the upcoming family gathering on March 15th, our 20th wedding anniversary, felt like the inevitable moment. That evening, 36 people filled our home, most of them Emily's family, along with a handful of close friends. The house buzzed with laughter and the clinking of glasses, but all of it sounded distant to me, like I was trapped behind a wall of my own thoughts. The food looked exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and yet everything tasted like bitterness. My heart pounded relentlessly as the evening progressed, knowing the moment of reckoning was drawing near. When dessert was served and toasts began, I stood to speak. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, but I managed to hold my ground. The room quieted as everyone turned their attention to me, expecting the usual pleasantries. I started light, talking about the ups and downs of 20 years together, weaving in a few anecdotes that brought polite chuckles. Emily smiled nervously at some of the jokes, clearly not expecting anything out of the ordinary. For a moment, I almost faltered, but then I saw Sophie rise quietly from her seat. She walked toward the door without a word, and Ryan followed close behind. Daniel lingered for a moment, glancing at me with an unreadable expression before leaving with his siblings. The entire room fell silent, their departure impossible to ignore. Emily's voice broke the tension. She called after them, her tone sharp, telling them not to be rude to me. Ryan paused briefly in the doorway, shaking his head slightly before continuing out of the room. Emily's panicked gaze turned to me, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. I told her it was fine, that they already knew what was coming. My voice felt detached, foreign even to me. She froze, confusion and fear written all over her face. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, her complexion pale as the weight of my words began to register. I turned back to the room, addressing the guests as if reciting something I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times. The words came out cold, deliberate. I spoke about revelations, deep ones, that had shaken the foundation of everything I thought I knew. When I revealed that Sophie wasn't my biological daughter, the room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Emily's quiet sobs pierced the heavy silence. Her hands covered her face as she shook her head, refusing to look at anyone. I demanded an explanation, but she said nothing, leaving me to fill the gaps myself. I didn't hold back. I named my own brother, Chris, as Sophie's father. The shock rippled through the room, and I saw Chris stiffen in his chair, his face pale and his hands clenched. Before he could speak, Laura, his wife, stood and blurted out something that felt like a punch to the gut. She said it wasn't an affair, claimed it wasn't about love or desire. It was a single night, she explained, meant to help Emily conceive. Her words tumbled out like some twisted justification, but they only made the betrayal feel colder, more calculated. I felt my legs weaken, my grip on the table the only thing keeping me upright. The reality of it all hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a plan, a deliberate decision involving people I trusted most. The room seemed to fracture. Friends shuffled awkwardly, murmuring excuses as they left, while family sat in stunned silence, avoiding my gaze. I scanned their faces, my voice dripping with bitterness as I asked who else knew. Some nodded reluctantly, their guilt written plainly on their faces. Others stared at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. When I pressed further, the blame shifted to Judith, Emily's mother. Of course, it had to be her. Judith, with her endless meddling and obsession with family legacy, had orchestrated this disaster. I couldn't contain the venom in my voice as I thanked her for single-handedly destroying my marriage. Emily finally spoke, her voice hoarse and broken, trying to insist it had been a mistake. A single, terrible mistake. But I couldn't believe her. Not anymore. When I asked about Ryan, her face went blank. The silence that followed was answer enough. I told her I had already done a DNA test, and as the words left my mouth, the last remnants of my trust shattered. The room was silent, but inside, my world had already crumbled beyond repair. Judith had always been the self-declared leader of the family, the kind of person who believed she knew what was best for everyone. Her sharp words and constant meddling had caused friction more times than I could count. But this was beyond anything I thought possible. Emily's sobbing filled the room. Her anguish almost drowned out as Judith spoke in a tone that was as cold as it was unapologetic. "It was for the family," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Emily wanted children, and you were struggling. Chris was, a practical solution, a way to handle things without creating embarrassment for anyone. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. The world spun as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. A solution? I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief and rage. You orchestrated this, and you think that makes it okay? Judith's face didn't flinch, her composure unshaken. You have your family, don't you? Sophie and Daniel. They're your children in every way that matters. Biology doesn't make a parent. Love does. Her words were a cruel distortion of everything I believed. Love? What love could possibly exist in such a calculated deception? One that took away my ability to choose, to trust. I glanced around the room, desperate for some sign that anyone else understood the depth of what had been done to me. All I saw were downcast eyes, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Chris tried to speak, his voice soft and unsure. David, it wasn't like that. I didn't let him finish. You didn't what, Chris? You didn't stop? You didn't think? You didn't consider what this would do to me, or to Laura? My gaze shifted to Laura, who sat frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling. Did you know? Were you part of this? Her nod was small, almost imperceptible, but it shattered whatever hope I had left. I knew, she admitted, barely audible. I thought it would be just once. I thought it would end there. Her voice broke, and she dissolved into tears. Emily spoke next, her words quiet and hesitant. I was desperate, David, she said, her voice thick with regret. I didn't know what else to do. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't think you'd ever. She stopped, her words trailing off. You didn't think I'd find out, I said, my voice laced with bitterness. That's what this is about. Not trust, not honesty, just making sure your lies stayed hidden. In that moment, the weight of everything crushed down on me. But with it came a strange kind of clarity. I turned to Emily, my voice steady even as my heart shattered. I can't do this anymore, I said simply. Not with you. Not with this family. I didn't wait for anyone to respond. I walked out of the house, leaving behind the suffocating silence and the broken pieces of a life I had thought was unshakable. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside, sharp and bracing, but it was better than the suffocating atmosphere inside. That night, I packed a bag and checked into a motel. I didn't sleep much. How could I? My mind raced with everything that had happened. But somewhere, in the early hours of the morning, I found a glimmer of peace. The pain wasn't gone, not even close, but I realized I still had choices to make. I had my kids, my real family, and they deserved the best of me. And so did I.